great working with our Senate team at Long Journal putting this panel together on free speech on campus. And this is part of our Senate team at Long Journal's speaker series about free speech more generally. We have some really great speakers here today, so I'm hoping you guys enjoy the panel and ask interesting questions. And hopefully, if you enjoy this event, it will make some of you less weary to come to other sites. With that, I'd like to introduce Julia Spivak, who's the managing editor of the Austin Team at Long Journal.
Hi, everybody. Thanks again. Wanted to emphasize what Anthony said. Thank you so much for coming to this event. I am the editor-in-chief of the Arts and Entertainment Law Journal, but I did want to give a shout out to Gabby Blum, our managing editor, who is also going to be a moderator, and our symposium editor, Devin, who worked really hard to get this wonderful panel together. And I wanted to thank all of the panelists. And for all of you guys, if you have already been participating in our three-part speaker series on free speech. This is the conclusion of our series, Free Speech on Campus. We're really excited for this third issue. And just want to hand it off to Gabby to introduce our panelists. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks, Julia. So, yes, I will be the moderator. Let me know if you can't hear me. I think I'm loud enough that you should be able to hear me. So I'm going to introduce all of our esteemed panelists. And I'm going to start here with Mr. He is a staff attorney at ACLU Speech, Privacy, and Technology Project, where he focuses on First Amendment speech protections. Prior to joining ACLU in 2018, he was a legal advisor for Africa at the International Center for Nonprofit Law. He has previously served as an assistant general counsel to the New York City Council, where he worked to increase transparency for council members' discretionary spending and contribute to the council's Friend of the Court brief against the NYPD Stop and Frisk program. In 2011, he was a senior policy fellow in the office of the Member of Parliament in Ghana. He has previously conducted research and wrote about U.S. foreign policy for the Century Foundation, a progressive think tank, and worked for the National Democratic Institute's Central and West Africa team. He holds a JD from NYU, where he was the Rudin Tilden Scholar for Public Interest Law and a Master of Public Affairs degree from the Woodrow Wilson School of Princeton. He earned his undergraduate degree in political science at Stanford. We are very happy to have you here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Professor William
Araza.
I'm sorry. He's a constitutional and administrative law professor at Brooklyn Law School. His teaching and scholarly interests focus on administrative and constitutional law. He is widely published in these areas, having written casebooks on the First Amendment and constitutional law. His book, Enforcing the Equal Protection Clause, was published by NYU Press in 2015, and he has served as the LexisNexis Law School Publishing Advisory Board. He's a graduate of Yale Law School, and after law school, clerked for Judge William Norris of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, and then for Justice David Souter of the Supreme Court. Thank you. Awesome. Then we have Mr. Blackman, Joshua Blackman.
Hi.
He is an associate professor of law at the South Texas College of Law in Houston.
I'm from Staten Island.
From Staten Island. And specializes in constitutional law, the U.S. Supreme Court, and the intersection of law and technology. He is the author of the critically acclaimed Unprecedented: The Constitutional Challenge to Obamacare and Unraveled Obamacare, Religious Liberty, and Executive Power. Mr. Blackman was selected by Forbes magazine for the 30 Under 30 in Law and Policy. He has twice testified before the House Judiciary Committee on the constitutionality of executive action on immigration and healthcare. He's an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute and the founder of the Harlan Institute and the founder of Fantasy Scotus. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.
And last but certainly not least is Professor Clay Calvert. He is the Brechner Eminent Scholar in Mass Communication and director of the Marion B. Brechner First Amendment Project at the University of Florida. He has authored and co-authored more than 150 law journal articles on topics related to freedom of expression. In 2018, Calvert was appointed by the University Honors Program to serve as an Elizabeth Wood Honors Term Professor for the academic year 2018-2019 and to teach a signature seminar in the spring 2019 in the honors program called Free Speech and the First Amendment, which fits perfectly with this. He received his JD with great distinction in 1991 from the University of Pacific's McGeorge School of Law, and then earned a PhD in 1996 in communication from Stanford University, where he also completed his undergraduate work. Thank you all so much for coming. That will be
Beat Cal.
that will be the longest I will talk, I promise. So I think before we get started, we're going to give each of the panelists about a little short 1 minute overview of what we're going to be talking about today. Does anyone have a preference to go first? All right, should we go down the line?
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabby, and thank you to the AELJ and to the Federalist Society for the invitation, and thank you all for excuse me, joining us for lunch. Sorry, I have a bit of a cough. But as you said, my role here is as on behalf of the ACLU's Speech, Privacy, and Technology team, where I focus on a variety of First Amendment issues, including campus speech. And just to set the table, I know you have a long list of questions for us, and I look forward to having more of a dialogue with you. But just to sort of set the table and give you a bit of my perspective, I think, despite what you may have read, I don't think there is a crisis of democracy or of constitutional norms on campuses. I think, if anything, we're seeing a reinvigoration of political activism broadly in the country, and that's included on campuses, but not just limited there, too. So we'll hear some stories about where people have exceeded legal limits, and that, I would argue, is to be expected of youth, and especially in these heady times where heightened rhetoric is being used by not just students, but a lot of different political actors. So I think that's sort of my basic perspective on where we stand, sort of trying to turn down the rhetoric around the crisis. But I think these are some really interesting and important issues to be thinking about, not least because there are a lot of competing First Amendment and free speech issues at play in a lot of these situations. We have speakers, we have listeners, we have protesters, counter-protesters, professors, lecturers, all having potentially competing speech interests at play. And then you have the universities, and I'll focus my interventions around public universities, which are most applicable to the First Amendment, but their sort of role in terms of protecting all of these competing interests. So I'll stop there, but I look forward to the ongoing dialogue.
Okay. So Gabby, thank you so much, and Devin, thank you. Thank the Journal, thank the Federalist Society, and thank you all for coming. It's really delightful that there's such a great turnout for such an important topic. This is a hard topic as well, so it seems to me it might help to begin with some common ground. Everyone can speak in a public forum. If someone has a permit to use a forum to speak, then he has a right to speak, and he has a right to have the police guard that right to speak. The question is, what kind of forum is an academic institution? At one level, of course, it's a place that's devoted to speech and inquiry. On the other hand, it's also a place where certain norms apply. There's a norm of professional excellence. There's a norm of equality. There's a norm of mutual respect for the academic enterprise. The first of these norms, it seems to me, requires that academic administrators exercise professional discretion when deciding who to invite to speak. Frankly, that means viewpoint discrimination. The second of these norms means that all members of the community have an equal right to share in that academic community, and that right can be infringed by speech. The third of these norms requires that all members of the community respect all other members. When that norm is violated, there's reason to be concerned, and frankly, sometimes reason for protest. This means that all student groups need to be mindful of this respect norm, both those who invite speakers and those who would protest those speakers. This also means that there are limits, both on the inviters of controversial speakers and on would-be protesters. It does not mean that these groups should avoid trying to invite controversial speakers, and it does not mean that opponents are justified in protesting any speech with which they disagree. There are hard lines to be drawn here, and I hope that over the course of the afternoon, we'll be able to hash out and discuss what those lines should be. So I'm looking forward to the conversation.
It's a pleasure to be here. I come all the way from Houston, Texas, but I'm happy home in New York. Last year, I was invited to the CUNY Law School across the river in Queens. And I was invited to talk about the topic we're here, free speech. You were all being very respectful to me. You're listening quietly. When I went to CUNY, I was protested. There were about 50 students standing outside the hallway shouting at me, calling me every epithet in the book, a racist, a bigot, a misogynist, go down the list. When I went to the room to start speaking, they surrounded me. They were saying all corners of the room, holding up signs, and every time I opened my mouth, they started screaming and shouting at me to prevent me from speaking. Eventually they left, and I was able to give a modified version of a talk, mostly Q&A, but I was the recipient of the sort of campus unrest that we see in many places. Now, I agree with my friend, it's not nearly as prevalent as the media may make it seem, but it does exist. And I want to address 3 points I think my good friend Bill is also addressing. First, who gets to decide the speakers that can come on campus? Can a student group invite whomever they want? Can the administration overrule that choice? Can the administration impose stringent requirements, such as paying security fees for a speaker to come? The second question is, once invitation is made, what then? Can the speaker be uninvited? If there is a disruption, what rises the level of disruption that you need to perhaps remove a student? And the final question is, if you have that level of disruption that you actually have to perhaps remove a student, what is the proper discipline? And does that discipline pose the risk of chilling student expression during heady times, as my friend over there mentioned a moment ago? And I think these are all serious questions, which I approach not only as a First Amendment professor, I teach the class, but also as a person who experienced it firsthand, who had to deal with this sort of protest in my own livelihood and how it affects my ability to convey messages to you and law students across the country. Thank you so much. I look forward to engaging your questions.
Well, first, let me do what everybody else did, and thank you all for coming. Thank the AELJ and thank the Federalist Society. I've published a number of articles, about a half dozen over the years with AELJ, so it's nice to finally be here to put a place with a journal rather than this thing in New York that I've never been to. So it makes it much more real to me, so thank you for having me. I teach in the University of Florida in Gainesville. I want to go over 3 big points to kind of set the groundwork. Diversity, equity, and inclusion and the First Amendment don't necessarily have to be in conflict. And I think that's important as an overarching thing, because most people today see diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, as in conflict with free speech rights. And I don't think they have to be, and I think what we have to ultimately do is find some way to balance those. They are not mutually exclusive interests. 2, I want to talk about, we have hurricanes in Florida, as you often know. We come through every year. October of last year, we had one in Gainesville called Hurricane Spencer. Richard Spencer came through campus. He was not invited. The University of Florida does not require speakers to be invited by faculty members or departments. We have an auditorium called the Phillips Center where anybody can rent it out. And he spoke. So I can talk about that in terms of counter speech, different doctrines that came into play there in terms of the heckler's veto. University of Florida spent more than $500,000 to protect his right to speak, which devolved quickly into a shouting match and really no dialogue. And finally, I'd just like to say kind of a big picture principle about why ultimately do we protect the speech of Richard Spencer's. It's not because their speech has any value. It has very low, if any, value at all. It's because we don't want the government to tell us what speech does and does not have value. President Trump is the government today. I think many people don't want President Trump telling us what speech has value. So again, we would protect Spencer's speech not because it has value, but because we don't want the government, the University of Florida, saying his speech doesn't have value. That's a dangerous argument. So that's my big picture.
Great, thank you all. I think that's a perfect jumping off point for our first question. So what First Amendment rights pertaining to freedom of speech and expression are students entitled to on campus? And as you stated, there's clearly a distinction between public universities, which are government entities, and private universities, because the First Amendment only applies to government restrictions on speech. So how should universities, both public and private, be dealing with this distinction? And how are these rights different than speech that is more restricted off campus? So if anyone wants to start the distinction, public and private, and how that affects speech.
I'll start. So as a general matter, the 14th Amendment limits state action. So if you're in a state university, your campus is bound by the First Amendment. A private college like this one, you're not bound by the First Amendment, although you are bound by a number of federal laws, because you guys use student loans and take federal money, that do limit the sorts of ways a school can treat you. Why is this important? if you're on a state university and you have a public forum such as the center in Florida, you cannot have viewpoint discrimination. You can't pick and choose that, this group, the ACLU can present, but the skinheads cannot, right? You have to allow an open range of viewpoints. In the classroom, the rights are somewhat different. So if you were in your first year torts class and you decide to start shouting out and yelling at your professor, you'd probably be suspended and maybe expelled from school, right? Because you're disrupting your class. The question is, where does events like this, speeches from outside speakers who are not part of your doctrinal events, where does that fall in the rubric? Does it have the same sort of choreography as a classroom setting? Are you required to sit here and be quiet, or can you disrupt? And if you disrupt, can you be punished for exercising your speech rights? It's not only the rights of the speaker, it's also the rights of the students. Both two directions are at issue here.
So I'll just add a very small point to what Josh said, and then maybe see where it goes from there. Everything Josh said is right. I think there's one thing that maybe I would add to it, or maybe just sort of emphasize one point that I think may be implicit in what he said, which is that when academic institutions invite speakers, they are making determinations about quality and about appropriateness. And so the astronomy department doesn't have to invite a speaker who says that the Earth is the center of the universe. That's viewpoint discrimination. And certainly that person would have an absolute right to speak at the University of Florida auditorium to the extent the auditorium is not part of the university's academic program. But the astronomy department doesn't have to invite him. I mean, that's kind of foundational. And I think based on that, maybe there's an entry point for thinking about some other limits that might be appropriate when people speak in an academic environment. I don't know what those limits are. Maybe we can hash them out, but I'll just sort of add that as sort of a little sort of piece to what Josh was saying.
Part of it, I think, depends upon the university's leadership, the president, the provost, whoever that might be, in terms of thought leaders, to articulate the mission of the university when it comes to both free speech and principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and what those mean. And then also to take the opposing side, as our president did, Ken Fox, in issuing videos and other statements in which he stressed that we vehemently disagree with the views of Richard Spencer, but we are mandated by law to have them. So counter speech from the highest levels of the university administration can be an important remedy, rather than simply saying, Richard Spencer, you can't come to campus. And that's important to understand.
Anyone else? Okay, great. So I guess what obligations then do the universities have to protect either these speakers or, in the counterexample, the counter protesters, either if they're students or outside?
Well, that's the big question. I'm sorry. That's the big question in terms of the cost. It becomes cost prohibitive, and we haven't worked this through with the First Amendment yet. There is no perfect system for this. So we spent more than $500,000 to prevent a heckler's veto by a hostile audience reaction, essentially, to Richard Spencer to allow him to speak. Okay. If in University of California, Berkeley spent more than $2 million, I think, in 2017 alone for a series of the University of California, Berkeley's in debt, right? They can't afford that. University of Florida, we couldn't sustain that model if we had a controversial speaker come every month to our university. We would not be able to have $500,000 ready to do that. There is no fee shifting here. There is no like FEMA, which is something our president proposed, like a FEMA system where there's a federal government pot of money that comes into play where if you are a public university and you have to keep spending this money to prevent the heckler's veto, which is anathema to the First Amendment, right? We've got to protect the speaker from a hostile audience reaction. Would there be this pot of money? We haven't really worked through that principle yet. We really had no choice, and that was very tough for people to understand. That we had to host him. We didn't invite him. As you said, it's the auditorium is not part of the academic curriculum, right? There are TEDx talks, there's plays, concerts, and so it's basically a speech auditorium, and you can't engage in viewpoint-based discrimination there. And that's where we were really up against it in that case.
Sort of taking one step back from that specific example, I think what you find in these type of calculations is that it's always going to be highly fact-specific. In terms of the forum analysis, what are the rules for the forum, what's advertised as the rule for the forum, who's been allowed to speak there before. And then the cost, I agree, is a line that's very hard to draw. But I think taking a step backward, you can imagine a situation where a school says, there's going to be controversy. We don't want controversy. Now, we can all, I think, probably agree that that's not a sufficient justification for not inviting or not allowing a speaker. I agree that the question of who invites is an interesting one. But I think what we see most often is that it will be some student group will invite a speaker rather than the university itself in a lot of these cases. So assuming that the school didn't make the invitation, it's just a matter of them providing the forum, the neutral forum. Just saying it's controversial, we don't want the bad headlines, obviously not good enough. Saying there's likely to be a security question, still not good enough in and of itself, right? We don't want them to say somebody might get angry, therefore we don't want to have this speaker. We need to have a little bit higher bar than that for protecting speech. Similarly, but then it starts to get into a highly fact-specific situation where, yes, we need to protect this person's rights. We need to take reasonable measures to do that. And we have these extreme examples of UC Berkeley where they called in security forces from all the other from several other UC campuses, and they can't be expected necessarily to spend millions of dollars routinely on this. However, as a government entity, it is the government's responsibility to protect First Amendment rights. And therefore, we should be very critical of these arguments that it's a security issue or it's a money issue. I agree that there are some practical concerns that need to be taken into account and that drawing that line is difficult, but I would just say in general that we need to be very skeptical of any sort of practical or logistical arguments that infringe on these fundamental rights.
So I'll just, excuse me, add a couple of doctrinal points and then maybe pose what seems to me a kind of a difficult question. So the doctrinal point basically reflects supports what's been said so far in this part of the talk. There's a case called Forsyth County versus Nationalist Movement, where essentially this is the problem of the government saying the speaker who wants to speak is too controversial, it's going to cause a big reaction, and we're going to have to pay to keep the peace, and so we're going to impose a big cost, a big fee on the speaker who wants to speak because of the controversialness of the views he wants to speak. And the court, I think, completely rightly said that's unconstitutional because how much you have to pay the police for protection turns on what you plan to say and how controversial what you have to say is. So I think that basic doctrinal point is right. I think, though, that once we start getting into kind of maybe more interesting and maybe more difficult issues about what should be the responsibility of student groups who choose to invite certain speakers to campus, then I think we need to start asking some questions about, for want of a better term, norms and what's appropriate in an academic institution. And it seems to me that what I called, and I just made these terms up, there's nothing magic about them, this norm of professional excellence means that it is inappropriate in some basic way for a student group engaged in an academic enterprise to invite a speaker simply for the purpose of provocation. I don't think that's a speech event. I think that becomes a different kind of event, and I think the First Amendment becomes more, not tangential to be sure, because there is speech going on, but I think it becomes mixed up in a whole lot of other issues that have to be thought about when we think about that decision by that student group at the school, not the university itself. That's different. By that student group to invite someone simply for the purpose of poking a finger into someone else's eye.
If I can maybe add, one more doctrinal point, because this happened with us in Florida. It's the incitement to violence doctrine, one of the exceptions to free speech. So speech that is directed, meaning intended to inciting or producing imminent lawless action and likely to do so, can be stopped. The incitement to violence under the Brandenburg test. And that was the initial justification our president made when we denied Spencer the ability to come to campus. And one thing I've looked at really is the Brandenburg Doctrine cannot be used as a preemptive strike to prevent someone from actually coming to campus. It's not a prior restraint mechanism. You have to allow the person to actually start to speak. And in that case, in that instance, then you can stop them. Based upon past violence, you can predict there may be a likelihood of it. But you can't just say, oh, Brandenburg, there was violence in Charlottesville, there was violence there. Now we can prevent him from coming to the University of Florida. Brandenburg doesn't work that way. I think you've got to allow the person to start talking. And then that's a hugely difficult call, isn't it? Because who's going to be able to stop him? The police on the ground, who probably don't really know the Brandenburg ins and outs at all if they're going to do that right. And so they're going to have to make a snap judgment call in that case. They're probably going to err on the side of protecting the peace rather than the controversial speaker's right to speak, too. But I just want to point that out that, we're thinking about exceptions to the First Amendment. How could you possibly stop somebody? Fighting words. Spencer never engages fighting words. He doesn't actually go face-to-face, one-on-one. He espouses hate, right? But that's absolutely protected, right? Hate speech is generally protected in the First Amendment. He doesn't engage in true threats of violence. That's not protected. And incitement's not protected. But he knows the lines, basically. He's very savvy about those things. So just to add to the doctrinal points on that.
And let me caveat a point briefly. We keep talking about Richard Spencer and controversial speakers. I'm not Richard Spencer, not by any stretch of the imagination. And a number of law students who will be taking the same bar exam that you'll be in a few months determine that I am the embodiment of hate. So what happens when the people applying these standards have only a black and white test? That if you're not woke, you're a member of the Klan, right? And that basically anyone to the right of Mitt Romney is effectively a fascist. When you have that sort of standard, that sort of litmus test, these doctrines are a lot more tough. And I have a high degree of skepticism that students and administrators who agree with the CUNY kids can implement Brandenburg in any sort of faithful manner, because they're going to think that everything is hate, and there's no place for hate. Love trumps hate, the slogans. Then you basically drown out the entire right side of the political spectrum, even people who might have worthwhile things to contribute to a debate.
I think Professor Ariza has succeeded in provoking with his bringing up provocation as being inappropriate. And I think I would argue, I hear your point, but I would argue that whether you think something is inappropriate or not is very different from whether it's constitutionally protected. And I think unpacking the difference between provocation, incitement, and fighting words is important. And I think, obviously you all are law students, but I think it's worth remembering. You sort of use the shorthand, but the bar for incitement is really high. You have to have a crowd, and you have to be specific. Even saying general things about wishing for violence in a sort of generalized way doesn't count as incitement, even though sort of in non-legalistic terminology, it would be considered incitement. But that legal test for incitement, really you have to have a whole bunch of people standing right there ready to do exactly what you're saying. So if you mean provocation to mean that, then obviously it's not protected. But I think we very much do want provocative speakers. You can probably put together quite a long list of interesting cultural and artistic voices that have been brought to campuses to provoke and have provoked thought and change. I think anytime someone's trying to change any kind of cultural norm or argue for whether it's a small revolution or a big revolution, they're trying to provoke. And I think the danger is when the government starts to get into not just viewpoint discrimination, but then I think what Professor Ariza brought up was even further is getting into their intent. And I think that would be very difficult for anyone to decide whether these are sincerely held beliefs or whether they're just meant to provoke. And I would argue that the person making the invitation would probably not be able to tell themselves whether they're getting some glee out of everyone else's anger or whether they're deeply held beliefs or some combination of the two.
So I absolutely agree with all that. And if we're talking Richard Spencer or any other boogeyman out there speaking in a public forum, then I'm absolutely on the side that of course he has to be given a platform, and yes, of course the cops have to protect him once the crowd gets rowdy. What I'm talking about is the unique context of an academic institution, and within that, the unique context of not administrators making decisions about what speech the academic institution believes is worthwhile, but the decisions of student groups within that institution making those kinds of decisions. And once we're talking about that subset of decisions, then I think we're talking about, again, and I kind of sighed before I said norms, because I don't have a better word for it, but I think we're talking about some sort of, maybe this is an even worse term, best practices for groups that both would be inviters and would be protesters. Best practices for them to think about when they decide who we're going to invite and how we're going to respond. I absolutely agree that, for example, a group that is thinking of, to use the term, deplatforming, and by the way, I think what happened to Josh at CUNY was absolutely wrong, no question about it. That's not even a hard case. But it does seem to me that that would-be protesters have to think long and hard about the best, most appropriate way to respond to speech with which they disagree. That response may, in some small set of circumstances, may in fact be to try to deplatform. But I think those groups have to think very, very hard about that before they engage in that. Similarly, I think student groups are going to be inviting speakers, have to think long and hard about whether what they're doing is in fact in the spirit of true invitation to exchange ideas, as opposed to something else. And you're absolutely right. There's no way to have a court second-guess those sorts of decisions. That's why I'm not saying it's a rule. That's why I'm floundering around with ideas like norms and best practices, because it is not something that I think is easily judicially enforceable for very good reasons. We don't want the government making these kinds of decisions, including a federal court. But I do think that there is some room for free speech discussion about these sorts of best practices.
One of the things you sometimes hear is, though, some people say, well, let's reach down and use the Tinker standard from high school, substantial material disruption, and that's just wrong because college students are treated differently. But some federal appellate courts will apply the Tinker standard to different student cases, especially students posting speech off campus on the internet, and then they'll suspend them for that because it violates professional norms or standards.
And then they get sued by the ACLU.
Yes, exactly right, exactly right. So you will see that, though, where universities will reach down, it take out, because the general principles we're talking about, Brandenburg incitement, fighting words, true threats, those apply to everybody off campus. So it's like, what rules do we have for schools? And then they'll go and they'll say, we've got this Tinker substantial material disruption. And then they'll go even more. We've got the Hazelwood rule. That's easy. Conflicts with pedagogical concerns. So that's kind of a dangerous thing. So the doctrines, maybe it's simply we need new doctrines somewhere, right? We can't. The high school ones can't really apply at the college university level. They're just not protective enough. The ones that apply off campus, maybe there's a new need, because when people think of incitement, they think of it very differently than they think of Brandenburg. I think the average layperson does. But as Emerson said, Brandenburg's a very high standard to meet. There was a case of Nwanguma versus Trump, which the Sixth Circuit decided, I think in September, in protecting Donald Trump. This was a campaign rally in Louisville, Kentucky in 2016, in which he yelled, and he'd done this at several other rallies, get him out of here. And then two of his followers proceeded allegedly to assault a couple of people in the audience. They sued, and the question was whether or not Trump's speech, get him out of here, was protected. Soon after Trump said that, he also added, no, don't do that. I always get in trouble with the media after I do that. And this goes to the question of intent, though. What was his intent? Because Trump made the argument, when I said get him out of here, I was talking to my security personnel, right? I wasn't talking to the people who support me to beat these people up. Plus, the other argument was he just said get him out of here. He doesn't say beat him up, hit him, do anything like that. And so you get to the circumstantial evidence of what is a speaker's intent, right? Because Trump says, I didn't intend it, and that's Brandenburg's first element, speech directed or intended to inciting. So it's a very difficult standard. Then you go down through this, thicket of circumstantial evidence. How do you determine what a speaker's intent is when there is some kind of violent reaction? But Brandenburg is really hard to meet. So maybe there need to be new doctrines. I don't know. I'm just pitching that.
One other context to think about is not only the Constitution, but Title IX and other administrative laws which prohibit what are called hostile learning environments. There was a situation at the University of Oregon about a year or two ago where a professor had invited students to her house for a Halloween party. She wore a blackface costume off campus at her house. Then she was tenured, by the way, at a state institution, and they tried to suspend her. Ultimately, they worked it out. I think she had an early retirement. The case just sort of faded away. But they basically tried throwing her off campus because they said her actions at a private Halloween party at her house where students were invited created a hostile environment inside the classroom. So the context of, are you in the classroom? Are you in the lecture hall? Are you in a public forum? Are you in a bar across the street from the campus? Are you in a dormitory? Are you in your private home, right? How far are we willing to take this notion of a hostile learning environment? And because it can sweep in speech in a large number of fora.
And of course, a university is all of the above. It's a learning environment, it's a workplace, and it's where people live.
Yeah, just 3 quick points on some of the things that have been raised. Sorry.
No, this is great.
You only asked one question, we're taking it the rest of the way.
That's what I expected would happen.
Just a quick, and I'm the only non-constitutional scholar on the panel, but at the risk of overstepping my bounds, I think when you're talking about when the university invites folks as a special case, I think that would count more as government speech, in which case the viewpoint discrimination is off the table.
Yeah.
So whereas the government can decide what it wants to say, it can't prohibit others from disagreeing with it. And I think what you're talking about in terms of when professors make those invitations, then you get into questions of academic freedom. And yes, they have the right to make academic judgments based on quality. But it's interesting also to see where the tensions between academic freedom and free speech also are both compatible and also in tension. And I think getting to the most interesting thing is what should students do? So if we agree that deplatforming is a violation of the speaker's constitutional rights, what should someone do when a professor does something abhorrent, whether in their private life or in the classroom or off campus? And I think one of the sort of pitfalls of this debate, this conversation I think is full of pitfalls, but one of the pitfalls is when people say you shouldn't shout down the speaker from standing right next to him. The implication is you should sit quietly and accept what he or she has to say. And I think there's a lot of space in between the two. And so I think I started out by saying I'm so encouraged by the reinvigoration or invigoration of the political conversation in our country, including on campuses. And so I think students who are outraged should show that outrage. And I think there are all sorts of ways that they can do that without deplatforming or violating someone's First Amendment rights. I mean, one story I've heard, I can't remember now the university, but some folks were outraged by the views of a potential speaker, and it was a ticketed event, and so they bought or reserved all of the tickets, and all showed up with their laptops and sat there and didn't pay attention, which I thought was brilliant.
That's my usual class.
Yeah.
With the exception of they all showed up.
I have that tonight at 6.
It's a familiar scene for law professors, but not for folks who are trying to make the news by provoking people to scream at them. Like, Professor Blackman obviously was not pleased to be deplatformed. I would argue that some of these folks, now getting into Professor Ariza's analysis of intent, are fully hoping that there is violence outside and that they make the news for not being allowed to speak.
Agreed.
And the worst thing that can happen to them is that they show up, 2 people are in the audience, and then they go home. So I think it's a strategic decision, and I always say that activists don't always listen to their lawyers, and that's fine. But I think there's a strategic decision to be made about how much of a fuss to make about any given speaker, because knowing that actually is playing right into their hands a lot of times. But there are a whole bunch of different ways that students can protest outside, can protest vocally online, can protest with posters, all sorts of ways that you can make your feelings known, have counter events, competing events at the same time, protecting First Amendment values, but not sitting quietly and accepting that this is an okay position to take.
And I think that was an interesting point, too, just to come back to the University of Florida example with Spencer, is how do students react? And our president actually issued his statement, and it got some pushback from a lot of students. And he said, don't attend the event. Versus, that's kind of like, okay, so his theory was don't attend the event, ignore him, don't give him the publicity that he seeks and he craves. Yet on the other hand, a number of students, especially Jewish and black students, said then we need to be there to counter protest, right? That is, we have to be there and confront this message. We can't just say, oh, we're going to let him go and do this. So it was an interesting position that our president took. He said ignore it. Have class, we had to have class, if things were to go on, we had security around campus. Obviously, a lot of people didn't show that day, But there was a sentiment against him, and he got pushback on that by saying, you can't ignore a speaker with controversial views like this. You have to confront him. And that was just so I don't think there is an easy answer to that, what the answer is.
Yeah, look, I completely agree with Emerson. This is a strategic decision, a tactical decision that would-be protesters have to make. And I don't want to, and I absolutely don't want to be understood, not that you would ever listen to me for tactical advice about how to protest anything. But I don't want to be understood as suggesting that the first thing you ought to do when you encounter a speaker that you don't like is that you should go and deplatform. No, absolutely not. Because of all the bad effects that Emerson and Clay are talking about, that may be tactically a terrible thing, and it may be morally a terrible thing if in fact it is sort of the wrong response to what's going on at the podium. And again, I would, and not to personalize, but that's what I think happened to Josh at CUNY.
Right, well, thank you. I think that leads right into our next question.
Question number 2.
Well, what rights, though, do students have that are going to these events? And do they have rights either, in some cases, like minority students, for example, there's events that have happened at San Francisco State Hillel with Jewish students who are going to events, and there's lots of protests against those students. What obligation does the university have, if any, to protect the students from counter-protesting, not just the speakers?
The students who are attending.
Who are attending?
Yeah.
From getting roughed up, you're asking?
Not necessarily, but from potential threat or inciting, in the case of San Francisco State, it was potential to turn violent. And I think there was lots of anti-Jewish sentiment and all the things that we can think of that come along with that.
So I'll start really quickly by just saying one basic point, which is the First Amendment right of the speaker is matched by the First Amendment right of the people who want to hear that speaker speak. And so whatever the protection the speaker gets, really the listeners ought to get it too. I mean, how much that is, I don't know. Hard question. But I just want to kind of lay that on the table.
One other issue, and I think Dean Chemerinsky, who's now the dean at the Berkeley Law School, has released he wrote a book about this a year ago, but released a statement saying that even though it's very expensive, the school should pony up the bill and pay for the security fee, because the alternative is actually quite worse. So I think maybe one policy is that each student organization gets one freebie a year, right? They get the right to invite one high-profile speaker in which the university will cover the costs. It's a viewpoint-neutral policy that can apply equally. And generally, these events take a lot of time to plan. Student groups probably can't do more than 1 or 2 at a time in a year anyway. So I think I kind of like the idea. It does have a cost, though, because when you're spending money on protecting Richard Spencer, that's fewer scholarships and fewer student activities. And the money doesn't come in a vacuum. Taxpayers may have to pay for it as well. But I think it does convey an important message to the public that speech is worth protecting. The alternative is when they say, well, you have to pay a $50,000 fee, and if you can't pay it, then your speaker can't come, then it gives a strong heckler's veto. Then all you have to happen is the opposing groups just say, we're going to protest, and then you kill the invitation. In fact, when I first was invited to CUNY, no one cared. But then a couple days before, someone found out, and they put all these pamphlets, and they tried to get me uninvited. And, the school could have knocked out my invitation. I probably would have sued them if they did, but they could have knocked out my invitation. Yeah. Oh, yeah. But if they uninvited me, it gives rise to litigation. I didn't sue them. The administration kept me safe as safe could be, I suppose.
I think going back to your question, and some of the points that have been raised, that there are these competing speech rights. You said, what rights does a listener have? As Professor Reiser said, they have significant speech interest in being able to listen to the speaker. Now, the protesters also have First Amendment rights, and the counter-protesters and the counter-protesters and the counter-protesters also have First Amendment rights. So again, this is going to be highly fact-specific, but if the question is, you have a controversial speaker of whatever political stripe is invited and is being hosted for some reason in a building, they have the right to speak, right? They can't be deplatformed. That we all agree on. The listeners also have the right to come and listen. The protesters have the right to protest. So the question is, can the listeners, I think what I'm getting at is your question is, can the listeners be protected from the counter-protesters on the way in? And I think what Professor Blackman was saying is, physically, of course. But protecting them from exposure to the protesters' ideas? Absolutely not.
Yeah.
Which is problematic, right? Because it means that someone's going to be subjected to some pretty difficult things that they don't want to hear. And this is the hardest part about the First Amendment. And I think you can all see, though, the difficulty that would come if people are protected as an absolute from people who disagree with them. Now, obviously, we can think about situations where someone is just going to hear some kind of religious lecture and people are spewing anti-Semitic epithets at them as they walk in. Horrendous. Terrible. Unequivocally bad. Unconstitutional? Probably not. And so the question is, then the university has to, provide physical safety for these people. And I think this sort of, I know this wasn't really a part of this question, but I think it sort of, I overheard someone earlier, someone who remained nameless said that they found speakers for this panel by Googling snowflake. So I think we might as well.
Not me.
Yeah. Yeah, no. Maybe it was a joke, but I think it's worth bringing up this idea of hurt feelings. Because as I said, this is not a small concern. I don't mean to diminish this at all. How does it feel to be walking into a lecture and have hate spewed at you? Terrible, obviously. I think I don't subscribe to the idea that students just need to have thicker skin, or they need to learn how to deal with people who disagree with them, or those sorts of arguments that you'll often hear, that they're just being too sensitive. I think to the extent that young people are reacting to aggressions, both intentional and non-intentional, to offenses, intentional and unintentional, they're reacting to generations of oppression and marginalization. I've had experiences in the classroom, outside of the classroom, of being offended by classmates, by professors, whether they intended to or not. These are real concerns, and these are real things that have been happening, as long as there have been universities. So all of this is to validate those feelings and not to overlook them or to say that they need to be brushed under the rug or that they're not important constitutionally. The question is, if the solution is to silence people, then I think we have a solution that's not worse than the problem, but has consequences for the problem that can be extremely severe. And it's not just a theoretical thing. I know people often say, oh, you're trying to protect, it's disingenuous. People often say to the ACLU specifically that we're being disingenuous when we say that we protect Nazis because it helps Black Lives Matter. There are people within the ACLU who protest and say, this is a nonsensical statement. Why would you keep making this argument? I hear that and I understand that. I also think, though, that there are concrete examples where legal precedents that were established to protect one kind of speech have been used to then protect speakers of the opposite view. This happens all the time. We use legal precedents that were established to protect neo-Nazi speakers, to protect Black activists in court. This is done. It's not a theoretical issue. It's not a future possible issue. And it's not to say that the playing ground is equal or that the courts have always been a great arbiter of social justice. Of course not. We lose a lot. We definitely disagree with a lot of judges. But just to say that there is real utility in the argument that holding a hard line is best in the best interest of others. And that's not to say that people's offenses are imagined or unimportant, but we have to be very careful when we start crafting solutions.
So, okay.
Yeah.
So I guess, I mean, I've never thought of myself as the designated fire thrower on any panel.
We need one.
But I guess I want to push back on this anti-deplatforming idea just a little bit, because hypothesize, I'm just thinking out loud here, hypothesize a speaker who comes to campus who's controversial, and hypothesize a counter group that doesn't want that speaker, and they give $1,000 to every person who promises not to show up. I think that's deplatforming in some basic way. Hypothesize a university rule that says you have to be quiet while the panel is speaking. That's deplatforming. But of course, we do that all the time, and that's perfectly appropriate. And so I guess I wonder whether in calling this deplatforming, we're isolating it as a phenomenon that maybe it's not, that maybe in fact it's sort of just a variant, maybe an extreme one, maybe an inappropriate one in a lot of cases, maybe in most cases inappropriate. But I wonder if we're isolating that phenomenon in a way that sort of makes it easy for us to dismiss it. And because I wonder whether we do it a lot actually, and we just call it something else. I don't know. It's an interesting question, I think.
I can take one, maybe go to a larger level too. When you mentioned Dean Chemerinsky, kind of at the macro level, he's considered to be very liberal, but on the free speech issues, he has this perspective which is very libertarian in many ways, I would say. And that's interesting. The court right now, obviously the conservatives and liberals are fractured, and we've almost seen the free speech flip-flop over the years, where now conservative justices are seen as the defenders of free speech and the liberal justices are not. But when it comes to offensive speech, the justices are pretty united in protecting it, whether it was Mattel versus Tam protecting the right to register the name The Slants, which was disparaging to Asian Americans, right? They protected that, protecting the Westboro Baptist Church's rights to engage in offensive speech. And you go back through all the laundry list of offensive speech cases, Texas versus Johnson, but under the Roberts Court, very protective of offensive speech. Mattel versus Tam and Snyder versus Phelps come to mind. Violent video games are offensive to many people. The court protected violent video games. Crushed videos were protected. They struck down a law. That doesn't mean, though, that, and this is where the rub comes in the academic context, where you put principles of equality, which is going to be the liberal side, if we stereotype it, versus the individualism of free speech rights, which would be the conservative side. So if you took one of these cases up, I think it would be fascinating today to see whether the general rule that we protect offensive speech comes into play differently when you're balancing equality, your Title IX principles that you were talking about, against the First Amendment. And so I don't know whether we want to see a case like that, but it would be interesting, just speculating about how today's court might do.
Well, of course, the wrinkle in Mattel v. Tam, I don't know, raise your hand if you're familiar with Mattel v. Tam.
That's not bad.
A handful of people.
That's not bad, actually.
So my background is, I went to law school, but then I worked on international law for quite a bit, and now I'm back in sort of the U.S. constitutional law realm, and people throw around case names all the time. And
I'm sorry about that. I should have gone into more
no,
detail.
you're a law professor, you're allowed to. But I think, so this is the one where a band was trying to register a trademark for the name of the band was The Slants. And the band was entirely Asian American. And so basically the trademark office said that they were denying the trademark because it was it was part of their guidelines that you couldn't grant trademarks that were disparaging. And this was seen as a disparaging term, and therefore they couldn't grant the trademark. Of course, the wrinkle of this case and the irony of this case is that it was only disparaging because it was being used by Asian Americans. Because there were trademarks and patents granted for all sorts of other things called The Slants, like, I forget what exactly it was, like ski poles or something like that. That had nothing to, because the word slants is not like the N-word or something like else that only has one meaning. Obviously the word slant has a lot of different meanings and connotations depending on the context. So the irony here was that it was only disparaging because the people using it were the subject of the disparagement. So it was like turned all backwards and in on itself. So I would argue that this one did sort of bring into play the issues of equality and inclusion in a very sort of backwards way. And basically the Supreme Court found that because that any kind of law that has that has disparagement as a criteria for government restriction is necessarily viewpoint-based. So the differences between content-based restrictions and viewpoint-based descriptions, which is something we've been sort of tossing around. But basically, the government has to be viewpoint neutral. They can restrict certain kinds of content, but they can't restrict certain viewpoints. And so the idea is if you're disparaging something, that means you're anti. But it would have been fine for them to trademark if their name was, proud to be Asian. That would have been fine to trademark. I mean, I don't know if that's too broad or whatever, but you get the point. That you can be pro something, but you can't be anti. And of course, they were trying to reclaim this term. And you can think about all the different ways that marginalized groups have reclaimed terms and retaken ownership of them, to take the sting out. And so that's obviously what they were trying to do. They weren't trying to be disparaging, they were trying to reclaim. And that's why the Supreme Court said this is an absurd situation and these types of laws are unconstitutional.
And then the roll-off of that is then that the Redskins get to go and re-register their name, the Redskins. So it has greater implications beyond that. Right now, just to take that one step further, there's another clause in the Lanham Act which prohibits immoral and scandalous marks. And a guy has tried to register fucked, F-U-C-T, to trademark that.
I think he's fucked.
He very much is. So, yes, the appellate court, the D.C. Circuit, Federal Circuit, said that indeed this is immoral and scandalous, but after Tam and other cases, it is protected by the First Amendment, too. So you have offensive words are going to be protected or things with this, but again, in an academic setting. So these are very different removed, but now the government in September, October, petitioned the Supreme Court actually to hear that case. In other words, the government wants to uphold the immoral and scandalous clause, which is a great use of our money. But anyway,
Hit me again. I mean,
exactly.
No?
Exactly. Anyway.
They're challenging that on the vagueness or on the viewpoint bias?
Both that the government's only interest, the only interest the government could assert in saying we will not register immoral or scandalous marks is protecting unwilling hearers from speech that may offend them, and that's the same argument that was struck down in like Cohen versus California. And so basically, that's their only argument. That the first of it's the protecting the unwilling hearer or listener.
So it's fucked the draft.
That's right. That's right. Exactly. I'd like to see that jacket.
I've cursed twice before 1 o'clock. Next question.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
this will be the last question, and then we'll do some questions from all of you, if you have some. So I know that there's been recently, not so recently, the creation of safe spaces and trigger warnings. What do we think about this, and do we think that this is a slippery slope towards stopping free speech, or it's protecting them? What do we think that these things are doing?
I think there's a big question about whether these things are mandatory or up to the discretion of the professor. And I think, I don't see it as a slippery slope. I don't see it as a problem. If a professor decides to give a heads up to folks that something is coming, I think that's entirely appropriate. And if they want to do that in their classroom, I don't see any reason that they should be criticized for doing so. I think making it mandatory is potentially very difficult to enforce, because then you have to define what is potentially triggering, which I think, depending on people's life experience, could be any number of things. And we're in a classroom with how many people, we've had how many different life experiences, suffered how many different types of trauma or loss or whatever in our lives. So I think making it mandatory is difficult, but I think as a general principle, I think it's entirely appropriate and responsive to people's experiences.
I agree with that.
Right. The difficulty is when you teach a class, and I've been teaching for years, and my colleagues have been teaching for a long time, you invariably take in consideration material that may be hard to teach in others. So if I'm teaching the Dormant Commerce Clause, I probably have a different mentality than teaching, I don't know, Dred Scott, right? I just approach the topic differently because I know it has a much more salience. But the notion of excusing students from a topic is one that I would draw the line. I think professors have a responsibility for academic freedom to treat the students with respect and care, but the exclusion from the academic classroom, that's where I would draw a line very quickly.
I've added to my syllabus in the past 4 years, and I teach an undergraduate media law class I'm in the College of Journalism and Communications, it's ad, PR, telecom, journalism students. I have added a statement in there that there will be offensive language used. We cover Cohen versus California, we cover Hustler versus Falwell, we cover the FCC versus Pacific Foundation. I've added that, and I always, there's no alternative assignment or anything. I'm just saying be aware if the Supreme Court justices can deal with these things, even if they don't want to use the words themselves. We are going to cover that. So I think that's fair. Sometimes it's interesting. There are levels of things I won't do. If we're talking about obscenity, I will never show pictures of that. I will never say the N-word. I will never use that actual word in class. There's certain things I won't cross. And then there's sometimes you say things that you realize you're using them and you don't think they're going to offend. So in defamation law, there's a whole series of cases about saying a woman is sexually promiscuous when they're not, and they actually use the term slut, and I use that word in class. And somebody showed up on my evaluation. You know, 2 people said, "Oh, what does that word mean? That's an insulting word." Slut shaming, the whole deal came after that. And I hadn't even thought of that because these are cases where they're saying, you know, somebody's sexually promiscuous, and the word is actually used. So I never used to have that language in there. Nobody mandates it. There are a whole number of different issues that come up tied to that, which I guess are more about transgender students, what pronouns, what words do you use too, and all these are kind of percolating up through. But it hasn't stopped what I teach. I just have we're talking about speech having rights and responsibilities, and I do try, there are certain things I just won't cross certain boundaries on.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. And now I guess we'll open up to everyone for questions. Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to ask you about sort of free speech protection when it's both the person speaking and the potential, I want to say like deplatformer is also a student. Like there was a case just yesterday where in an opinion piece a student used the term illegal aliens, and then a bunch of students tried to get her kicked off the student council and like followed her around like protesting that speech. So I'm wondering like, what do you think is the balance there between protecting one student's free speech and then another student's right to protest that student?
Yeah, look, I think it's tough. I mean, you know, let's substitute the N-word for illegal alien, and you know, how does the hypo come out? And if it comes out differently in your heads as you're thinking about that, then ask yourself whether this is really an exercise in line drawing rather than an exercise in, you know, any kind of a priori reasoning. You know, look, people have a right to use lots of words, and the way we frame things matters, and it matters for the speaker too. And the speaker has a right to frame things as well, right? So the speaker has a right, if she believes that illegal alien is the best way to describe these people or this person, then that's how I should just, you know, I have a right to describe it that way, that person that way. I think there's a right to protest that. I think protests can, you know, shade into harassment. Maybe that's one way to think about this kind of issue, right? Is, you know, a letter to the editor, absolutely. A note on the dorm room of the students who wrote the op-ed, I'm not so sure, because that kind of gets into, that's kind of like hits literally close to home.
Part of the big picture too is in an educational environment. Students who are 19, 20, 21, and 20, they are going to make mistakes. It is a learning environment, and really, I mean, I know it is true, and people will look back. You've probably all said things at some point you want to take back, and especially when you're 19 or 20. I don't know the age of these students, and sometimes maybe they don't know. You know what I mean? And so that also is there. So the first reaction can't be, oh, you know, this word or that word, and the speech code that comes from enforcing certain words is good or bad. You can't say certain things, and so sometimes students may literally not know. I know a lot of my students don't know a lot.
And what are undergraduates being taught? And at Professor Calvert, you're learning a lot. But students perhaps only taught one side. They talk about the importance of diversity and inclusion, and they taught nothing of free speech. Most teenagers can't identify the values in the First Amendment. They can't identify the rights in the First Amendment. So if they're only being taught one side of the fence, not the other, it's unsurprising of these sorts of events, which is why people should teach these things undergrad.
Right. One of the things too, I think it comes up, and I was somewhere else a couple weeks ago on this, and I honestly think it goes back to the students and our emphasis on STEM. I know this is going off on my own little track here, but we place so much emphasis on science, technology, engineering, and mathematics that basic civics and understanding of the First Amendment, I think that it's a viewpoint neutral document, all the major things we've talked about, that it protects only against government speech. Many students don't get that when they come as an undergraduate level. They don't know that. Oh, the NFL, the Kaepernick, that's First Amendment, you know. And I'm always, the NFL acts like the government. You know, it thinks it's the government. It's not. But it's always, these are versus a high school student who takes the knee in California. You know, and I think the ACLU defended in that case. Yes, he's got a right to do that. You know, and the school can't say no, we're not going to allow you to take a knee. So somewhere along the line, I think the problems that percolate up to college level that we're seeing probably start down below by people not having any understanding of a lot of civics. I don't know.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah.
First of all, I wanted to say that how terrific a panel this is. The speakers are all extraordinarily articulate and, of course, learned. Nevertheless, I must confess that I disagree with the general drift of the panel. Professor Ariza said, with whom I generally agree, said at the beginning that universities are devoted to speech and inquiry. That's a quote. That's false. Universities are devoted to inquiry, and in relation to inquiry, speech often occurs. But the idea that universities are in the business either of promoting or protecting speech is a false idea. Freedom of inquiry and freedom of speech are two entirely different things, and in fact they're opposed. Freedom of inquiry involves university personnel, faculty members, committees, chancellors, deans, in saying who can and cannot speak. The entire business of universities is in a business of excluding voices rather than welcoming voices. What you have to ask always is what's the purpose of the institution? What is it that we're doing here? And what we're doing in universities, again, to quote a phrase I think of Professor Ariza's, is the give and take of an exchange of ideas. What has to be recognized, another phrase of yours, is that the context of the university is unique. And what makes it unique is it precisely that it's devoted to deliberation of a certain kind. Now, it seems to me that any university administrator who has the authority to do so has every right to decide that something doesn't contribute to the university's business. That something might be a speaker, something might be an activity that occurs on campus. I would want to say that Hazelwood and Tinker do apply insofar as they stand for the general proposition that the business of the university should not be disrupted. We are not in the free speech business, and I think the inability of administrators to understand that, in general, the inability of administrators to understand anything is largely responsible for the problems we have. And just as an extra coda, students don't have any free speech rights.
So I'll take your first comment as a friendly amendment, and at the very end, and your last comment about the lack of knowledge on the part of administrators. As a former vice dean at 2 institutions, I agree.
I say that as a former.
Thank you.
I mean, obviously, in an academic setting, and this is something, it's absolutely true, you restrict speech all the time. So if I'm creating my curriculum for a class, I'm going to include certain books, and I'm going to exclude other books. Or I'm going to choose, if I'm creating a reading packet, nobody does that anymore, but if I were to do a reading packet, I would include certain articles and I would exclude others. And certain views I would find worthy of my students' learning, and certain views I wouldn't, right? So that goes to the academic freedom notion. We mentioned that earlier today, and academic freedom is a very fuzzy concept. Who possesses academic freedom? Is it the individual professor? Generally, it's actually the institution, right? But certainly the institution can control its curriculum. It can, one of those 4 principles, right? It can, the student body that it admits, who gets to teach, what's taught, and who comes in, right? Those are the 4 major principles of academic freedom. But they're very fuzzy around the edges. So,
well, I think a couple of points. One is, I think when we're talking about the university's right to decide who it invites and who it doesn't invite, I entirely agree. I think when you're thinking about the university as a public space, and even one I would push back against speech versus inquiry, but even if we're talking about inquiry, if a student group wants to engage in inquiry by inviting a speaker, then we start this whole thing again. I don't think we quite avoid it by saying it's just about inquiry. And finally, while, as I said, the ECOU will be very quick to sue anybody who wants to apply Tinker to the university setting, it was even in Tinker that the government said that students don't lose their First Amendment rights at the gate, at the schoolhouse gate. So if 4th graders don't lose their First Amendment rights at the schoolhouse gates, certainly we can agree that 21-year-olds shouldn't lose their First Amendment rights on campus.
I disagree.
No.
That's the point of this panel. That's great.
Clarence Thomas has said that if given the chance in Morse versus Frederick, which is the bong hits for Jesus case, Clarence Thomas said that if given the opportunity, he would overrule Tinker.
Absolutely right.
He thinks kids have zero free speech rights. You have to talk through the parent in loco parentis, as they say.
Right.
Okay, I think
Not
we
in
have
loca,
one
live in
more
la vida
question.
loca, but in loca.
Does anyone have one more question?
One more question, my goodness. Make it good.
I guess to build off of the point that was just made, I think it's important to keep in mind that universities are quasi-public spaces and that the First Amendment seems to be pretty context dependent in general. So there's this statement about the First Amendment not being barred by the schoolhouse gate in the prison context. There's a statement by Justice O'Connor that the First Amendment is not barred by prison walls. But nonetheless, it seems like the federal courts are very context sensitive when they're applying what is and what isn't allowed. And I'm just wondering, in the modern university where there's not only the classroom walls and the ability to punish students for speaking up during a math lecture that's part of their core curriculum, but also residential education and this idea that university students are going through a holistic process of education, does that change a state university's interest when they're making judgments like, we don't want Richard Spencer on our campus because his message is damaging to the overall pedagogical goals of being at a university, which is not just learning how to be an engineer, but learning that people deserve respect, that multiculturalism is an important part of our society, and that ethno-nationalism and a white supremacist state is bad and has no place.
I think your residential education, or res ed, is a good example of what we were talking about. Where is the location being, right? Is it the auditorium? Is it the classroom? And that kind of straddles there somewhere in between, because in the dorm, the RAs, or we had RFs, whoever it is, right, the RAs are there to help provide part of that system, right, and provide programming typically in the dorms. I can imagine that would be a fascinating scenario if the RA is invited into a dorm at a public university, a speaker with a controversial viewpoint. That would be a very interesting scenario, because indeed by its name, residential education or res life, something like that, it suggests that there is some kind of education going on in that setting. I don't have an answer. I'm just kind of marking.
Yeah, I mean, it's as you said, I agree 100% that it's a very context specific. I mean, notwithstanding those in the room who clearly want to overturn a lot of Supreme Court precedent, I think the inquiry at least is along the lines of context and what the rules are. The rules have to be clear, they can't be vague or overbroad, and they have to be viewpoint neutral. So the university doesn't have to open up necessarily any fora, right? They do have control over their campus, but the question is, once they have opened up a fora, and have made it known that this is open, whether it's in the case of University of Florida, where they say it's open to anybody for any reason at any time, invitation or not. But there are all sorts of variations along this line, where once the fora is opened up, then you have to respect rights within the context of whatever kind of forum you've created. I'm sorry that doesn't answer your question, but I think it does get to the question. It's not just about sort of in the abstract, what kind of forum is it, but it's also very much in terms of what has the university explicitly stated is, or by practice, has set aside this particular situation as. And you can imagine if there's a rule that there are no speakers allowed in the dorms, that's viewpoint neutral. It has nothing to do with how controversial a speaker is. That's just a rule. But once you've said that we're going to have a speaker series and anyone can nominate speakers, or they can come, by any set of regulations you can imagine, then the inquiry has to really go down that line.
Okay, well, thank you all so much for this.
Thank you, Beth. Always good to see you.
If you haven't signed in, please sign in. I think there's more pizza and soda. Thank you all so much.